So this is unbelievably the fourth video where I'll be talking about the NRL's potential expansion into Perth, and it has been an absolute roller coaster ride to get here. Just under a year ago, I spoke about it as my preferred option for the NRL's 18th team, saying this: I do think if I were to pick one, it would slightly be Perth, because it's a market that we have less of an existing foothold in, so there's more growth potential. Then 2 months later, it was being reported everywhere that the NRL had agreed to terms, that the deal was done, and that an announcement was imminent that Perth would be the NRL's next team in 2027. In a video in which I pretty much just gloated about being right for 7.5 minutes, I went into their entire strategic plan and said this: the Bears have the potential to be an absolutely brilliant asset to the game. Finally, we've re-established a bit of a foothold in the west coast of Australia, and we get to reward fans like the ones who showed up to that Dolphins versus Roosters game the other week. But the bid just kind of hung there in purgatory for ages, and it wasn't until 3 months later that there was really any news that was worth reporting on. When in last December, it was announced that the involvement of cash converters Peter Cummins, who was bankrolling the entire thing, had fallen through completely over his unwillingness to provide a licensing fee that the NRL expected. It was sort of an anti-dilution thing to minimize the impact on other clubs, but he was not willing to pay it and it fell through. Nonetheless, I remained optimistic, saying the Papua New Guinea bid will be announced imminently, with Perth still a bit of a developing story. But I do have confidence that the Western Bears will get across the line, particularly given how strong their bid was said to be back in August. Now, the first thing I want to highlight is, holy hell, how was that me 4 months ago? I genuinely look half as masculine as that guy does. He looks like he'd go out into the forest, kill a wild boar with his bare hands, bring it back home to me and say, "Dinner's served, my Pookie Bear." Anyway, a lot has happened in terms of Perth over the last 2 weeks, and it's a story that often misses the limelight in favor of Fox spending an hour misreporting that every high tackle will now be a sin bin. So, without further ado, let's get into it. On the 4th of April, the Sydney Morning Herald reported the unfortunate news that the NRL was set to walk away from expansion talks with Perth, with a formal announcement expected that the plans were going to be postponed. After things fell through with cash converters, there were approaches from private investors who were willing to bankroll the bid. One approach, famously, was from representatives of the Newtown Jets, although ironically they couldn't get their goals aligned with the representatives of the North Sydney Bears. Ultimately, the outcome that Andrew Abdo and Peter V'landys decided was best was to have the team affiliated with the North Sydney Bears and bankrolled by the NRL with significant investment from the Western Australian government. And the WA government were very on board, reportedly being willing to commit between $350 to $5 million worth of investment. They were also willing to add another 5,000 seats to Perth's HBF Park, as well as adding a heap more corporate facilities there and giving the NRL a period of free rent in the venue. Things were looking really promising, but then the state elections in Western Australia came along and they slowed proceedings to a frustrating halt. It became much harder to get both parties to the table, and to make things worse, they traded public jabs, with WA Premier Roger Cook criticising the NRL for only considering the WA bid to be a cash cow. Knowing this, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that it expected discussions to be shelved, quote, at least for the next few years. And honestly, that was a very reasonable conclusion to draw at the time. But there are a select few figures in our game that have the ability to breathe life into a conversation that seems dead and buried. And much to the joy of Perth expansionists such as myself, Wayne Bennett spoke up. In an interview just before his Rabbitohs played a game in Perth, Wayne said, "Don't give up. I can't believe the growth of the game here and the interest in the game, and how many people recognize us now. Perth's ready for it. I know they want it. So I just hope they get a deal done, and I'm sure they will." On the eve of the NRL doubleheader in Perth, the bid suddenly had the backing of one of the most influential figures in the history of rugby league in this country. And so then we had the doubleheader itself, which was something that I would consider a success. Over 31,000 people showed up for it, which, though it was the lowest crowd we've had for a doubleheader in Perth, was pretty decent considering that there were groups of Western Bears supporters who had discussed boycotting the event entirely. Given that talks at the time were being reported as dead and buried, I've got absolutely no doubt that there were certain fans who couldn't be bothered showing up for what they perceived to be a lost cause. But the crowd numbers show that there's interest there. You have to remember, we also sold out HBF Park for last year's regular season game between the Dolphins and the Roosters, not to mention a heap of successful ventures through State of Origin into Western Australia in recent history. I think the doubleheader was proof of the continued appetite for rugby league in Western Australia, despite so many people dismissing it as a state that we've lost to AFL. More importantly than the crowd though, the doubleheader had the effect of bringing both parties back to the table. NRL representatives were obviously present at the fixture, as importantly was the Western Australian Premier Roger Cook. The two parties spoke at various events throughout the day in what was described as last-ditch talks to help save the venture, with Roger Cook himself reporting the overall feeling of the talks as positive. He did say he couldn't make much comment on the discussions until they were complete, but he felt good. Speaking to Fox League, he said, "We are determined to make it happen." The NRL do acknowledge that the goal of getting to 20 teams by 2030 is now out of reach, but they do hope to get there by 2032. They'll give them a much stronger package for the next broadcast deal than what they'll have going into 2028. On a personal level, as I say, I have been so vocal about the fact that Perth is just the option that makes the most sense for a litany of reasons. Not only is it evidently a keen market, but the WA-based sponsorships that the team would draw makes it a really solid financial option. Though many people are concerned about the amount of travel time the team will have to go through, it's actually not that much worse than what we currently have. The flight time from Perth to Sydney is only slightly longer than both Auckland to Sydney and Port Moresby to Sydney. Evidently, it's not something that has stopped the NRL in the past. Plus, for a player that has been raised in Australia, living in Perth is a much less daunting prospect than living in Auckland, let alone Port Moresby. The big one though, in my opinion, is the time zone that Perth is in. I think this is so important and I can't believe it's not spoken about more. A 6 PM Sunday time slot in Sydney is still only 4 PM in Perth. That is early enough to get a really solid crowd out to the game while providing us with a very optimized new time slot for the East Coast. 3 Sunday games is something I would absolutely love to have. Plus, and this is crucial, in terms of international aspirations, Perth exists in the same time zone as 60% of the world's population. Yeah, 60%, you heard that right. And look, it might seem like pie in the sky thinking for now, but we are a game who currently has lofty aspirations, and having that in our arsenal is way better than not having it. It could become a really important strategic asset to have a team in Perth if we are looking to expand into the Asia Pacific in the future. I just think there's far too many advantages that a Perth team would bring for this not to happen. I am so confident that we are going to get a Perth team in the NRL before we hit 20 teams. The backing of the North Sydney Bears is big. The branding of the Western Bears is pretty much all there, and with a 20,000-seater rectangular stadium built in the heart of the city, this is just a no-brainer. I just hope that egos and bravado don't get in the way of what is a tremendous opportunity for our game. So that is the 4th video on Perth done. Will there be a 5th? I hope so. I hope it's me covering their announcement that they'll be coming into the NRL as the 19th team. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.